Academy, Sir Alfred Munnings.
On the evening of the 24th of April 1949, Sir Alfred Munnings got drunk. Then, England's most outspoken painter got up on his favourite hobby horse to blow one final blast on his hunting horn.
Your Royal Highness, my lords and gentlemen, I find myself a president of a body of men who feel that there is something in this so-called modern art. If you paint a tree, for God's sake try and paint it to look like a tree.
Munnings' home, Castle House in Dedham, Essex, has been preserved just as he left it. The walls are covered with examples of his work. This is a corner of the world that will be forever Little England.
And on my left I have Mr. Winston Churchill, and I know he is beside me because once he said to me, Alfred, if you met Picasso coming down the street, would you join with me in kicking his something, something, something? I said, yes, sir, I would.
This piece of painted satire is Munnings' attack on those British connoisseurs stupid enough to take the upstart Spaniard Picasso seriously, and, still worse, to parade his works in London. Munnings' antidote to what he saw as this modish claptrap still occupies pride of place at Castle House. He called it My Wife, My Horse and Myself, and it's the distillation in oil on canvas of all his beliefs about art. Munnings' picture is extremely nostalgic, quite funny, and also rather sad. It isn't a masterpiece, but it's the most defiantly English picture of the 20th century. It's an old-fashioned picture, 200 years old-fashioned, in fact. It was painted on the eve of the Second World War, but its heart is in the 18th century. My Wife, My Horse and Myself is a salute to the golden age of British art, a tribute to the painters who forged not just a native tradition of painting, but an instantly recognisable symbol of British nationhood out of their innumerable canvases of horses, wives, selves and country estates. Munnings was right to value the art of the Georgians. It's become our calling card to the world. But I think he was wrong to value it for his rather blimpish and insular reasons. The greatest British painters of the 18th century, Gainsborough, Reynolds and Stubbs, weren't conservative Little Englanders, but the men who put British art on the map. They were pioneers who rose above the ordinariness of their subject matter to produce works that belong at the very core of the Western European traditions of painting. During the course of the 18th century, Britain became one of the richest and most powerful countries on earth. This was the age when the aristocracy became the ruling class. These were the men and women who'd finally emerged victorious from 2 centuries of religious and political upheaval. They'd survived the Reformation, the Civil War and the Glorious Revolution, and they'd learned from their history. Works of art and architecture were commissioned in unprecedented quantities. But never in European history have the upper orders of a great nation chosen to express themselves and their aspirations in such a quiet and toned-down way. They didn't build grand public monuments, like the French, but private country houses. They didn't design huge emblems of national pride, but landscape gardens. This is Stowe in Buckinghamshire, one of the greatest of Georgian estates. It was built by the Temple Granvilles, the most powerful aristocratic family of the century, and several villages were demolished to make place for it. It takes a certain kind of arrogance to do all that for the sake of a garden. But the garden itself at Stowe does a wonderful job of cloaking that arrogance in a soft, green, apparently humble disguise.
Oscar Wilde once said that the British were always talking about dull, ordinary things like the weather, or gardens, or cats and dogs, and always meaning something else.
Here at Stowe, it's possible to see the visible origins of that tendency, the famous irony of the British. Stowe is full of signs and symbols, triumphal arches, obelisks celebrating British maritime supremacy, statues, and other kinds of monument. But because they're presented so unassumingly, overgrown, half obscured by trees, or reflected in water, they have an informal quality, and they don't quite feel as though they're meant in deadly earnest. This lightness of touch, when it comes to singing your own praises, was the most original invention of the 18th century British aristocracy, and Stowe is its subtlest example.
I think of it as the greatest collaborative work of art produced in Britain in the 18th century. A huge and complicated statement of national identity. It's spoken in rather a quiet voice, not shouted.
This garden is the absolute self-consciously British opposite to a French garden like Versailles, with its regimented perspectives. There's no such thing as a straight line here, and the mood is pensive and changeable. The most cunning piece of arrogant modesty at Stowe is here, in the so-called Elysian Fields, where there's a shrine to the great heroes of British history, from Alfred the Great to Walter Raleigh and beyond. But the joke is that this apparently jingoistic monument's been put at the bottom of a wet gully, in one of the most out-of-the-way corners of the garden. Only a people who really did believe in their own greatness could have carried off this kind of self-deprecation. But then perhaps you can afford to be magnanimous when you're running the largest empire in the world. This arrogant modesty didn't come from nowhere. It evolved over a long period. At the very start of the 18th century, the landowning classes were still looking to France and Spain for their architectural inspiration. This is Blenheim Palace, designed in the early 1700s by Thomas Vanbrugh for the first Duke of Marlborough. It was built to celebrate a momentous triumph over the great enemy, Louis XIV's France, which it does in grand operatic style. But this is the sort of palace that Louis would have built if he'd won the battle. Consequently, the British never really warmed to Blenheim. It was too French, too royal, too Catholic, and it would be one of the last houses built in this swaggering style. The sun had set on this kind of borrowed grandeur. If Blenheim, with its great counter-Reformation painted ceiling, is an opera chorus singing fortissimo, then the classical Georgian house is a cool Roman orator. British power is proclaimed here on the ceiling at Stowe, with steely resolve. In their own minds, the Georgians weren't competing with the fat cat kings and courtiers of Europe. They were looking back, for their role models, to what they saw as the purer and nobler civilizations of ancient Greece and Rome. The British aristocracy's dislike of foreign flashiness expressed itself most clearly at the level of scale. Van Dyck's proud equestrian portraiture gave way to a smaller, more softly spoken kind of painting, the sporting picture, the picture of a gentleman at hounds, horse and rider seen usually not in the foreground, but the middle distance. The grand Baroque portrait of the 17th century also became something less assuming. It became the conversation portrait, a picture of people conversing among themselves, albeit rather stiffly, rather than posing like the characters in some Italian opera. This genre was practised most memorably in the 1740s and 50s by the journeyman portraitist Arthur Devis. Devis painted the minor gentry as mannequins, lit by an aquarium light in airless interiors or echoing aristocratic halls. There's a sense of loneliness, too, in his best work. There's something terribly buttoned up and sad about these children. Seen but not heard, they've had to learn to be reserved and English before any child should.
One of the best places to appreciate the qualities of Georgian restraint is here in Edinburgh. There's restraint in the very stones of this great city. The architecture of its Georgian squares and terraces is noble, but also rather reticent. Perhaps it's no surprise that some of the most memorably discreet pictures of the 18th century should have been painted by Scottish artists.
Allan Ramsay spent the bulk of his career in London, but despite that, he's one of the first artists in whose work it's possible to detect a self-consciously Scottish sensibility, a restraint even more reined in than English reserve, which reflects the abiding pull which Calvinism has exerted over Scottish minds and morals. Ramsay was the first in a line of exceptionally gifted and original 18th century British portrait painters, and he anticipated the work of Sir Joshua Reynolds in particular. His very finest works are portraits of women, and the finest of all is perhaps this picture of his wife, full of a sense of the secret, inward life of the individual. The acute Scottish dislike of pretension also produced one of the comic masterstrokes of 18th century art, Henry Raeburn's picture of the Reverend Walker, out skating, lost in the quiet rapture of his hobby. It's a wonderfully soft and witty celebration of proud, oblivious eccentricity, and a declaration, too, of one of the sacrosanct principles of 18th century Britishness, a man's right to his own enthusiasms, no matter how strange or absurd he might look in the indulgence of them. People who put on too many airs and graces have never been popular in this country, and the vengeful hostility of the British to those who set themselves up too high was very much a force to be reckoned with in the Georgian period, especially in a busy city like London, where the rich were particularly exposed. Satire thrived here in the 18th century as nowhere else in Europe. The great London satirists, men like Rowlandson and James Gilray, were scourges of pomposity and corruption. While every other European elite treated this type of satirical art with brutal censorship, in Britain the aristocrat or the politician pretended to laugh along with everyone else while he was being pilloried. So it was that the same society that had brought the art of my wife, my horse and myself into being also came to produce an artist like William Hogarth. Hogarth was the guilty conscience of the Augustan age. He looked behind the elegant houses of the well-to-do into a different and a darker world. He spent his career devising grim parables of life as he saw it, and the first of them, which he published in 1732, told the story of the fact, the first British artist to have a public in the modern sense. His prints appealed to the huge new class of artisans, tradesmen and merchants that Napoleon would later have in mind when he called Britain a nation of shopkeepers. It's that part of the nation that's always loved to gloat over the misfortunes of others, that's always enjoyed seeing vice punished and believed that hanging's too good for 'em. Hogarth was an artist with the mentality of a hanging judge. Everything in his pictures is treated as evidence, to be registered, bagged and sealed. The rutting dogs stand for lust. The monkey symbolises adultery. The plucked chicken is the sign of the virgin who's gone astray. Even Hogarth's most apparently innocent pictures are laden with curious, ominous details, like portents of doom. Hogarth included a bust of Sir Isaac Newton in one of his portraits, and he was clearly an artist much influenced by the theory of gravity. Things are always falling in Hogarth's world. When people get drunk in his art, they don't leap about or sing and dance. They slump. They fall over.
Well, show me the way to the next whiskey bar. Oh, don't ask why. Oh, don't ask why. Show me the way to the next whiskey bar. Oh, don't ask why. Oh, don't ask why. For if we don't find the next whiskey bar, I tell you we must die. I tell you we must die. I tell you, I tell you, I tell you we must die.
The action in Hogarth's pictures almost invariably takes place indoors, and what an airless, oppressive indoors it is. The room is always a box. There's no escape.
Hogarth lived his morality, as well as turning it on everybody else. And this severe self-portrait shows us just how little colour he allowed to intrude into his own world. Just a few dabs of flesh-coloured paint on a palette dedicated to grey and black. Hogarth had the blackest imagination of the 18th century. This, his final work, is the artist's vicious goodbye to life. Forget the rake and the harlot. This is the last plate in the world's progress. The sun will soon be extinguished. Nature is used up and barren. There's no point in fighting or painting or dreaming or aspiring, because in the end, only death and darkness wait.
In fact, Hogarth's life and times mark a sea change in the history of British painting. So far in this series, I've talked mostly about art that was designed to serve the purposes of those who commissioned it, whether priest, monarch, or landowner. From now on, I'll be talking a lot more about the purposes of artists themselves. The painter has come out from behind the canvas.
British patrons, however, were much less interested in living British painters than dead Italians like Titian. The Georgian period was a great age of art collecting, and the German immigrant Johann Zoffany's portrait of milords gathered in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence is a brilliant record of the aristocracy's greedy desire to own and enjoy the masterpieces of Renaissance Europe and classical antiquity. Looking at art was one of the few ways in which the British gentleman could indulge his sensual passions, and I think Zoffany understood that very well. Under the guise of connoisseurship, his art collectors are oogling these painted ladies and male nudes. They're men with bulging eyes and breeches. The letters and diaries of 18th century artists resound with complaints about their thankless lot, condemned to furnish the aristocracy with pictures of itself, its wife, and its dog. But painters gradually formed a resistance movement against what they saw as this tyranny of triteness, and their first leader was one of the most famous, and also one of the most underrated of all British artists.
William Blake described Sir Joshua Reynolds as a scoundrel and a knave. But nowadays, people just tend to think of him as a monumental bore.
Reynolds founded Britain's first trade union of painters, the Royal Academy, and he himself has been remembered as a bit of an institution, venerable, but rather unlovable. But I love him. In this, his early self-portrait, he's painted himself as an excitable young man looking eagerly into his own future. In fact, he was about to embark on a journey that would change him forever. In 1750, Reynolds went to Italy, where he was entranced by the masterpieces of Italian Renaissance painting. The Sistine Chapel had a huge impact on the impressionable apprentice painter from Plymouth. For the rest of his life, he'd regard Michelangelo as a virtual god, and these his greatest paintings as the Mount Olympus of art. While English milords went to Italy to buy, Reynolds went to learn. You can still sense the tremendous excitement his Italian experience aroused in Reynolds by studying the sketchbooks which he took around with him when he was there. He filled their pages with drawings of paintings by the old masters: Algardi, Domenichino, Ghirlandaio, Poussin. Reynolds took them back to England with him 3 years later, fired with the ambition to establish a school of British painters who'd at least attempt to live up to these examples. Throughout his later life as president of the Royal Academy, Reynolds would encourage younger British artists to aspire to higher things than mere portrait painting. He himself genuinely hoped that he'd be remembered for narrative paintings, like this huge picture of Macbeth and the Three Witches on the blasted heath. But it's a blasted wreck of a painting. The sad truth is that Reynolds totally lacked the imagination and the technical ability to tackle such large themes. To make up for it, he tried to make his pictures look old masterly by artificially aging them with vinegar and candle wax, with visibly disastrous results. But Reynolds did find a way of getting at least some of his ambition into his bread-and-butter portraiture. This is a Michelangelo which he'd copied in Italy. In England, it became this portrait of Mrs. Hartley and her son. This was a compromise, but a brilliantly clever one. His sitters got to play at being gods and goddesses, while Reynolds himself got to play at painting in the grand manner of the old masters. It was a game of extravagant fancy dress, in which no one, neither the painter nor his aristocratic sitter, could be accused of taking their role too seriously. Reynolds got richer and richer as the lords and ladies of Augustan England queued up to be turned into Apollos and Hebes and cupbearers to the gods. The most brilliantly ironic artist of his century, he was the quintessential painter of the age of arrogant modesty, forever putting subtle little jokes and disclaimers into the grandest-looking portraits. Here, a young nobleman looks at first sight like the hero of a terribly grand Baroque portrait. In his red velvet suit, he's flung an arm out across the landscape to show us all that he owns. Look again, and that's not actually what he's doing. He's thrown a stick for his dog, and his dog isn't impressed. Only Reynolds, of all 18th century portrait painters, could have sailed this close to the wind of satire and got away with it. I think he did so because he was, at heart, an essentially generous artist who saw the best in those he painted. This is the explorer Joseph Banks, whose adventurous spirit obviously appealed to Reynolds. He painted him as if he was on the eve of another voyage, trying to persuade us to come with him. Reynolds could also be a wonderful painter of diffidence and difficulty. This is his portrait of Samuel Johnson, struggling to turn another elegant Augustan phrase. And this is Laurence Sterne, the author of the great experimental novel Tristram Shandy, hiding behind the barrier of his wit, arming himself against the world with a raised eyebrow. This picture of Mrs. Abington, actress and courtesan, is a masterpiece of humane painting. An extraordinary picture of a girl who's pulled herself up into the higher reaches of society through sheer willpower. She's tough, but also vulnerable. It's an image that's echoed down the centuries. He saw how difficult it was to be a woman in the 18th century, even a well-bred woman. And I think that's the subject of this painting of the Lady's Waldegrave. This is Jane Austen's world put on canvas. A world where every young woman, whether she be first or third born, has a different price on her head and different expectations to match. She keeps the drawer of her chastity locked firmly shut. She cultivates her needlework, and she hopes that the elusive single man in possession of a good fortune may one day smile on her. But if I had to choose his very greatest picture, I think I'd choose his portrait of Mary, Countess of Bute. Reynolds hasn't painted her as an aristocrat, but just as an old lady, clutching her parasol with strange, subtle defensiveness. I don't know the background to this picture, and I don't particularly want to. She could be anyone, and that's the greatness of the painting. It plunges you into someone else's difficult life. Reynolds had a great rival, who also spent his life trying to raise British art to new heights. But whereas Reynolds wasn't a naturally gifted artist, his rival was a master of technique, and for him, beauty had to come through paint and paint alone. He would go out for long walks, gather together pieces of rock, bits of moss and lichen, and he would bring all this back to his studio, where he'd black out the windows, light candles, and build curious tabletop landscapes. Then he would start to paint. His name was Thomas Gainsborough.
Gainsborough's favourite paintbrush was very long. It was 6 foot long, in fact, and it used to shake about like a fishing rod when he painted with it. But he actually wanted the effect of beautiful vagueness that this imparted to his pictures. Everything in his painted world had to look as though it had been touched by magic.
Having spent his childhood in Suffolk, he set up his first studio in Ipswich, where he made a steady but unspectacular living. He painted gentlemen farmers and their families in their natural habitat, a lush pastoral England, which Gainsborough cultivated and improved in art, just as his clients did in reality. But there was always poetry in Gainsborough's soul. There's an extraordinary atmosphere of hushed expectancy about this painting of a girl reading a novel in a park. I'm always hypnotised by her look, and I've never worked out what it means. She's the English Mona Lisa in a green English landscape.
Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, one of the best portraits of his early career, is a picture which also, in many people's eyes, represents the very essence of Gainsborough.
This is a marriage portrait, a gentle celebration of human fertility and the fecundity of nature. Mr. Andrews has an expression of complete self-satisfaction on his face. Mrs. Andrews has melted into a state of gorgeous languor. The wheat field's a visual quote from Shakespeare, a way of telling us that he's ploughed her and she will crop. But there's nothing louche about the sexuality in the picture. Mrs. Andrews is ethereal as well as sensual, and her dress is like a piece of fallen sky. There exists a classic Marxist interpretation of Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, which accuses it of glamorizing an oppressive elite, and makes it Exhibit A in the case against Gainsborough, conclusive proof that he was a small artist, a hireling of the rich.
But my Gainsborough wasn't like that. My Gainsborough was a fantasist and a dreamer.
How much higher he would rise, even than Reynolds, above mere portraiture. This picture of Mr. and Mrs. Hallett isn't a portrait. It's a dream, a fantasy of rural contentment, and it's even painted with the feathery, unreal texture of a dream. Gainsborough was never a vulgar painter, but the keenness of his attraction to beautiful women gave his pictures of them an extraordinary charge of muffled sexuality. A mood of eroticism, which, because it's been channeled into the painting of a dress, or a neck, or a half smile, or a gaze, is all the stronger. With the caress of his brush, he performed a wonderful conjuring trick. Like Reynolds, he turned aristocratic women into goddesses. But the Gainsborough goddess was a Venus, and she was as sensual and lovely as any painted in the 17th century. No wonder he was so much in demand. Only Van Dyck had done this before in England, and Van Dyck was Gainsborough's favourite painter, his equivalent to Reynolds' Michelangelo. The difference was that Gainsborough came closer to living up to the example of his hero.
We know that Gainsborough thought an awful lot about sex. He used to sign letters to his lady friends, yours up to the hilt. Sometimes he would become so sexually aroused by a beautiful aristocratic sitter that he would have to go into town and buy himself a prostitute. Once he got the clap so badly that his death was reported in the newspapers, and he had to write in to say that Thomas Gainsborough the painter was still alive.
Like Reynolds, Gainsborough mostly worked within the limits of his aristocratic patron's requirements. But unlike Reynolds, who was at his worst when he painted from his own imagination, Gainsborough was capable of extraordinary things when he was painting purely for himself. Diana and Actaeon is his only mythological painting. We see a man, the painter's alter ego perhaps, pierced by the sight of female beauty. Actaeon the hunter has spied on Diana bathing, and he's about to die for it. Beauty, pain, and a sense of dissolution are combined in this exquisite and breathtakingly original picture. Everything here is turning into everything else. Water into smoke, Actaeon into a stag to be hunted down, and Gainsborough was dying. this was his last painting. When he was on his deathbed, he asked Reynolds to come and see it, and Reynolds did. The old rivals sat and talked for a while, and made their peace. Reynolds left him. Gainsborough's last words were, "We're all going to heaven, and Van Dyck is coming too." But another man was, in my opinion, the very greatest British artist of the 18th century. His name was George Stubbs.
This is Newmarket, or headquarters as people who work in racing call it. It was Stubbs's headquarters too.
Reynolds had painted selves, Gainsborough had painted wives, but Stubbs painted horses, and he painted them like objects of reverence. He didn't chafe under the yoke of his patron's preoccupations. He managed, I think almost effortlessly, to be himself and only himself all of the time.
This is his picture of Gimcrack, the most popular racehorse of the time, winning the 3:30 at Newmarket on the 10th of July 1765. Stubbs painted it for Gimcrack's owner. It's a very old-fashioned painting in one sense. The horse and his jockey each appeared twice in it, once winning the race itself, once being greeted by the triumphant trainer and industrious stable lad.
But there's a kind of melancholy at work here too. Only Stubbs could have painted this strange, rather sad, sleepwalking figure of a jockey. And the painter's left something out. He's left out the huge crowd that saw Gimcrack win his race. There are never any crowds in Stubbs. We don't know very much about Stubbs, but he was born in Liverpool in 1724, and he seems to have been self-taught. He was one of the quiet revolutionaries, a painter who changed the world without the world even noticing. He studied anatomy as a young man, drawing and cutting up dead horses. It was his first and his last obsession. Every other British painter of the time had learned to paint essentially by looking at other paintings. But Stubbs learned to paint by looking with intense closeness at reality.
Stubbs painted horses. It's true, but it's only half true. His greatest pictures have a haunted, visionary quality, completely unique in 18th century art. They're paintings of what it means to be alive, of what it means to be.
Not since the days of ancient Greece had the horse been so charged with life. Stubbs's work is the Parthenon frieze of the British art tradition. He loved to isolate forms in space, and I think he wanted his paintings to have the grandeur and the dignity of classical sculpture. It's as if the intensity with which he saw things forced him to see them in a state of disconnection, cut off from one another, isolated. That's why the act of touching is so charged in Stubbs, almost electrically charged. The gap that separates all living things from each other has been bridged. A groom rests his hand on the flank of a horse to reassure or to comfort, but how much feeling Stubbs puts into this simple gesture. This is British art's equivalent to that great reaching, creating hand of God the Father that Michelangelo painted on the Sistine ceiling. This huge picture of a racehorse called Hambletonian may be his masterpiece. Stubbs has managed to force so much emotion and so much sympathy into a picture of so apparently little. I think Stubbs's real subject here is the bond of affection that exists between the exhausted horse, who's just won a hard-fought race at Newmarket, and his attendants, a small, hard-faced man and a pragmatic boy. They've led their own hard lives, and their sympathy for the horse is their way of loving themselves. Stubbs painted everyone with democratic compassion, regardless of their class. The humane simplicity of his art revived a great tradition. In his hands, the northern realism of Hans Holbein came to life once again. Many of the animals which Stubbs painted were the trophies of a newly powerful British Empire, symbols of the spread of British influence overseas, of the new worlds opening up before the gaze of men like Captain Cook and Joseph Banks. But Stubbs never painted them as trophies. He saw them in all their animal otherness. There's perhaps no more affecting image of loneliness, of confusion, of a sense of literally being out of place, than his extraordinary picture of a zebra amid the greens and russets of an English wood. Stubbs's sympathy extended not just across the barriers of class, but across the barriers of species. In Stubbs, a dog can be as dignified as an aristocrat. Like Hogarth, Stubbs was a great leveller, but he was a much greater artist. In fact, he was one of the most brilliant poets of the British levelling imagination. The other side of Stubbs's intense, undeceived realism was his morbidity. He became preoccupied almost to the point of obsession with the dangerous side of nature, with predators and violence. This portrait of the Earl of Clarendon's gamekeeper is one of his darkest and most troubled pictures. Ostensibly, it's a picture of the natural order, man at the top of the pyramid, his trusty dog beneath him. And beneath the dog, the animal that he eats to live. But night is closing in, and the certainty of man's innate superiority to the beasts feels less than certain to me. You can feel the first tremors of a new age here, an age of doubt and uncertainty. Stubbs was a great artist, by which I mean more than that he was a great British artist. He was a great world artist. And that's where Sir Alfred Munnings made his great mistake. The subject matter of Stubbs's art might have been my wife, my horse, and myself, but the subject matter is not, in the end, the point. Stubbs's pictures of horses have nothing in common with Munnings's dry, academic exercises in equestrian art. What made them great was the tremendous weight of feeling that Stubbs invested in them.
And if I had to think of a 20th century image of a horse that is true to the spirit of Stubbs, I'd choose one by Sir Alfred's old enemy, Pablo Picasso.
Stubbs wasn't too complicated an artist, and in the end, I think he knew just a few things, but he knew them and he was moved by them, as profoundly as any painter has ever lived.
What did Stubbs know? He knew that we're all just bodies moving through space, and he knew that finally we're all alone.
Next week, the history of British art is at the earlier time of 715. To learn more about the British art in this series and where to find it, please send a cheque or postal order for £3.50 to British Art, BBC Education, P.O. Box 7, London, W5